Good evening and welcome to the British School. I'm working quite slowly as I see the participants are joining us. The numbers are clocking up as I speak. And welcome to the fourth lecture in our series accompanying our annual master's course in the archaeology and topography of the city of Rome. Tonight it's a special pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ben White. Ben is an illustrious alumnus of the school's undergraduate summer school, the class of 2016, as well as the City of Rome course in 2018. He's since gone on to pursue doctoral research at Nottingham University, where he's completing his thesis on the development of the porticoes as an architectural type from 200 BC to 100 AD, under the expert supervision of Mark Bradley, Alex Mullen, and Diana Spencer from Birmingham. Ben is an architectural and social historian, but he also has some prestigious experience of field archaeology, having taken part in Dora Chirone's excavations at the Horia Agrippiana in the baking hot summer of 2019. Since last autumn, he's been based here in Rome and has worked in the BSR archive on the Eugene Strong and Thomas Ashby correspondence. Tonight, we're to hear a preview of his PhD research in a lecture that is ideally suited to our City of Rome course and which we are recording for a future upload to our YouTube site. I'm now going to disappear from the screen, but I'll be back at the end of the lecture to pass any questions you may have to our speaker, and you can send the questions using the Q&A button on your screens. So here is Ben White and Saepta, Porticoes, Politics and Performance in the transition from republic to empire.
Thank you very much, Robert. Share this. Hopefully you can all see this.
Yep,
I'm just going to stop my video because in the moments preceding this, we decided that it was better if I turned my video off so that the sound quality is better for you all. But hello. So before we begin our talk tonight, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to Robert for inviting me to speak. For it does not seem like too long ago, I was sitting in those seats myself, those in the lecture theatre downstairs. I am honoured. Anyone who's been lucky enough to experience the city with Robert will appreciate not only the breadth and depth of his topographical knowledge, but also the unassuming manner in which he communicates it, which thereby encourages others to engage, myself included. I would also like to thank the British School as an institution for all their support, kindness, and enthusiasm over the past few years. I've been given opportunity after opportunity there, and I will continue to strive to do that justice. This institution, however, is made up of people. While this place has introduced me to some wonderful colleagues, it has also helped to cultivate lasting friendships with some incredible people who have, in turn, shown me ways of approaching, talking about, and interacting with the world that I find valuable and enriching. Thank you also to the exceptional community of staff here at the school, the directors, the library and archives team, and those who keep this place running. A semblance of family, which has been so distant from me in the past year as I've moved to a new city, has been so important. For all this and more that I can fit into this brief note, I'm so grateful. Turning to our focus tonight, I should preface by stating that I am currently in the final stages of my PhD, and we focus on a key monumental space of my dissertation. And so this talk represents a kind of elevator pitch of the wider discussions that I'm in the process of writing up. While it is primarily aimed to supplement the citywide excursions of the cohort of master's students currently at the school, I would of course appreciate constructive conversation and feedback, as ever. Buildings and their decorations constitute valuable documents for the study of history. Sitting in the seats of the BSR's lecture theatre, Osborne thus began his lecture. The words have clearly stuck with me. Tonight, we take the Saepta as our document for study, which we find outlined in blue on the right, taking up position adjacent to the Pantheon's unmistakable dome. Translated into English as enclosure, this particular space helps us to articulate some of the important roles that monumental porticos played in the lived experience of the city of Rome. We should explore the development of this built environment over the last century BCE and first century CE, from the historically sacred and traditional urban space in which Roman citizens came to perform their constitutional right by turning out to vote during the Republic, all the way through to a bustling, vibrant, cosmopolitan marketplace, which was given its architectural definition by porticoes. This latter point is what we are most concerned with this evening. I strongly believe, and I do hope to demonstrate, that further scrutinising the development of portico architecture can help broaden our understanding of ancient Rome and indeed of urban space more widely. Let me just do the slides. So you're in the right lecture, don't worry. I imagine you weren't expecting to encounter such paintings, but please bear with me. The events of the past year have impacted our lives in manifold ways, and the ways we think about the worlds we inhabit have been adjusted. I think it's so important to address this. If we hark back to this time last year, which seems so distant to me now, the very nature of human interaction was drastically changed, with imposed lockdown restrictions leaving our cities vacant and their social spaces migrating to digital counterparts. Art provides means to interpret our world. The many layers of meaning I find in these paintings are predicated on this context, and very probably were not or unimaginable by their creator. That creator was the Greek-born Italian artist of the 20th century, famous for his metaphysical work surrounding the Italian piazza, Giulio de Chirico. At left, we encounter a muted, eerie scene, almost totally devoid of human activity, except for a foregrounded silhouette of a solitary girl who tentatively crosses the empty streets, playing with a hoop, all under the surveillance of an enigmatic presence made known via menacing, diagonally cast shadow. Arcades frame the episode, which at the very same time ground us in the environment of the piazza, but disorientate us with their perspectival lines and associated vanishing points, seemingly opposing one another. On the right, we again find ourselves in a vacant, ghostly, abstract space, defined by arcades. In the center looms a white statue of Cavour, draped in the early evening shadows, and to his right, a male figure, elegantly dressed, occupies the interior of the arcade, standing alone, gazing out. I am, of course, only a humble ancient historian, by no means equipped with the intellectual and theoretical toolkits of a trained art historian. Still, de Chirico's rendering of such dystopian public spaces have pronounced pertinence to the experience of the past year. For the pandemic forced our cities into distilled galleries of strangeness. Take, for instance, the absence of human activity in spaces such as Piazza Navona or the Trevi Fountain, which we witness through the glass digital lenses of our smartphones. The built environment lost its actors and itself. For us too, important for us too, is that de Chirico framed his composition in an urban sensibility which was deeply structured around arcaded architecture. These serve to place the viewer in a familiar context, standing almost as metonym for public urban space and the diverse spectrum of social interaction therein. Spiro Kostov wrote, "In every age, urban spaces have served to stage spectacles in which the citizenry participated as players and audience. Urban life is nothing if not theatrical." This conceptual framework, to me, is key for understanding the role of colonnaded architecture in a city. Now, I can't do justice to the extensive body of literature which has investigated space in the city of Rome here tonight, but for the students, I thought I'd list a few which have been particularly important for me, such as the edited volumes of Spencer and Lamb, or The Sights of Rome, Lawrence and Newsom's Rome, Ostia, Pompeii, Ostenberg, Malmberg, and Bjornaby's Moving City, and most recently Caldelli and Ritchie's City of Encounters, alongside monographs such as Sumi's Ceremony and Power, Russell's Politics of Public and Space, and the extensive work of Holkerskamp. Suffice to say, the rhythms of daily life in the city of Rome have rightly been characterized as a perpetual spectacle, with each beat drawing meaning from a continually growing and spatially anchored web of connotations. Fundamentally, in contrast to de Chirico's visions, we need to repopulate the stages of urban theatre with its citizen performers. To help us in this endeavour, we have this series of wonderfully evocative frescoes depicting a scene of urban life from the house of one Julia Felix in Pompeii. For us Roman topographers and historians, the scenes will be familiar. Like a time capsule, the frescoes provide a tantalising glimpse into a world of social interaction once framed by porticoes. Although it is generally a better methodology to look directly at our primary evidence, to save our eyes and in the interest of time, these engravings made in the 18th century can help us to quickly point out the key activities in the frescoes. Depicted in the series of panels are the myriad daily activities which we might encounter in a Roman urban space. We see merchants selling the diverse range of goods we expect to see in antiquities cosmopolis. We also have a group of free school children with writing tablets being taught in full view of a quite overt and gruesome display of punishment. Also, patrons stand with clients and fathers with sons, conversing together as they observe a group of equestrian statues, in front of which a public notice is on display. A further group converse in pairs, some holding curious cups purchased perhaps from the local market stalls. Crucially, every scene is given architectural definition by porticoes. If we look more closely at the scenes, as Russell has pointed out, we notice figures lurking in the semi-private framed interiors of the colonnades, collectively observing the urban spectacle and their role as spectators. This is Mediterranean people watching at its finest. Frakes, who has written a compelling monograph charting the development of porticoes in Roman Gaul, so loosely modern day France, comments that representations of columnar space display notationally the results of lived experience. Thus, this artistic choice to frame the entire composition with a unifying architectural backdrop, given further clarity by these undulating garlands, is highly significant. It speaks of a collective perception of the portico as symbolic of urban life and the world of social interaction framed in. We thus find ourselves in that fantastic sector where the hard and soft city intermingle. I present these scenes in order to give you a visual flavour of the types of experiences encountered around portico spaces and to establish in your minds just how significant their introduction to space might be. Now, tonight we're going to turn to the Saepta Iulia, and thinking diachronically forces us to engage with the way space changed over time. Space does not exist in a vacuum. People use it, interact in it, reinterpret it, change it, reshape it. At Rome, sometimes we fall into the trap of collecting the various functions of urban space into a conglomerate, when in reality, these functions were fluid, changeable, and distinct across the history of experience of those spaces. This approach can also aid our understanding of the role of the built environment in broader socio-political change. And in the case of tonight, the Saepta, due to its functional relevance across the centuries, can be put to use to contribute to the lively discourse surrounding the transition from republic to empire. We will, however, naturally need to be more general in our discussion to cover these chronological periods. First, we shall set out the context into which the Saepta porticos were introduced during the late Republic. The intention here is to demonstrate the extent of a transformation a freshly conceived marble colonnaded enclosure posed. Next, we shall bring together the available evidence to reconstruct the form of the dedicated Saepta with special reference to the Severa marble plan. This inaugurated enclosure, complete with the common artistic displays that we habitually associate with the porticos of Rome, will be contextualized in the persistent manipulation by members of the Augustan imperial circle of the politically functioning stages of the Republic. Lastly, during the early imperial period, this space takes on new functionality, especially in its role of facilitating urban spectacles such as gladiatorial combat, theatre performances, and imperial addresses to the citizens. This final section outlines the transition of the Saepta to the marketplace, come art gallery, come spectacle space, come promenading arena that we discover in our Flavian sources. So we turn now to the Republican context. The most important evidence, I think, for the construction of the Saepta comes in a letter by our dear friend Cicero, who writes here to Atticus in 54 BCE and explains his plans for urban development, which he had been asked to undertake on behalf of Julius Caesar. We shall achieve something really glorious, for in the Campus Martius, we are going to construct covered marble barriers for the assembly of the tribes and encircle them with a lofty colonnade, a mile of it in all, and at the same time the Villa Publica will be attached to our building. Although this project was ultimately taken up by Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the triumvir, and dedicated as the Saepta Iulia by Agrippa nearly 30 years later, this testimony is important for grasping the principal intentions behind the Saepta in the Republican context. First, this was to be a work of exceptional quality that would rival the basilica that Paulus was building or renovating even in the Forum, as well as complement Caesar's extension of the Forum with his own new one. Second, porticos were to be put to use in completely enclosing the extramural space in the Campus Martius, designated for political gatherings of the centuries and tribes. Third, this colonnaded space would be integrated into the Villa Publica. This latter point could lead us to a really interesting topographical tangent, but we don't have time to explore that tonight. So, Caesar's porticoes basically redefined the setting of the Roman elective process. The constitutional mechanics of this are complex and have been extensively studied. I'd refer you to the work of Taylor, Rome's voting assemblies, and Morrison's plebs and politics in the late Republic. Some of the pertinent points can be set out as follows. An assembly is a solemn procedure which involved a magistrate calling Roman citizens to a religiously demarcated space, a templum, in order to cast their legal judgment. In the late Republic, there were two main elective assemblies, that of the centuries, the Comitia Centuriata, and the tribes, the Comitia Tributa. The former was an assembly of citizens arranged according to their contribution to the state, i.e. their property classes, and it elected the highest political offices, the consuls and the praetors, who would be their commanders, and the censors who took the census on which membership was based. This was lawfully perceived as representing the urban army, and it thus had to congregate outside of the city's sacred boundary in the ancient military exercise ground of the campus. That extramural seasonally flooded space we find represented here outside of the city's walls. The voting procedure of the centuries in descending order ultimately meant that those with more wealth and status had more influence in political decision-making. The assembly of the tribes, on the other hand, elected the lower offices and encompassed the representation of, in theory, all citizens according to their tribe, that critical indicator of Roman citizenship. This assembly could meet inside the pomerium. However, in the late Republic, it became more common in the campus to accommodate for simultaneous voting and swollen numbers. In format, the two elective assemblies voted almost identically. After augury was properly observed, citizens were called to a richly demarcated precinct, wherein the magistrate addressed the unorganized attendees and reaffirmed what it is that their vote will decide. Afterwards, the citizens were ordered to form themselves into their appropriate voting units in specially erected fences, Saepta, wherefrom they would tread laterally towards the tribunal, access to which was conducted by special bridges, and on which they would cast their ballots in the surveillance of the magistrates who sat there. The containers into which their ballots were cast were presided over by custodians who tallied the votes not by total number, but instead by the majority in each voting unit. So this process undoubtedly took a great deal of time, and we need to imagine throngs of voters recently out of the voting enclosure intermingling in the campus. And in fact, Cicero understands this moment as the opportune moment to kickstart his electioneering for the consulship the following year. Everything about this process necessitated ample space, and the campus provided. As Taylor points out, because of consistent practice, the campus became used as metonym for elections. It is difficult to get a sense of the physical makeup of these voting enclosures in the Republic, but we have some helpful literary testimony. Servius, commenting on Virgil, writes the Saepta are spaces in the campus martius with wooden enclosures in which it has been customary for the Roman people on foot to cast their ballots. Before Caesar's initiative then, the voting enclosures were most probably temporary wooden structures, which were seasonally set up. Importantly, however, there was no architecturally permanent demarcation of the entire voting space. We should imagine Roman citizens forming orderly lines laid out in the broad expanse of the campus in the roasting summer sun, for elections were held in July, standing and stepping towards the performance of their constitutional right, all under the surveillance of the presiding magistrates, their fellow citizens, and the divine. This image is afforded further meaning when we consider an alternative description of these voting enclosures, sheepfolds. For ancient writers, there existed a clear parallel between Romans in assembly and sheep grazing, and that metaphor persisted even after the space was rededicated as the Saepta. The takeaway from this survey brief of electoral procedures is that this was a religiously and historically protected ritual of citizen participation in the Republican system of government. Voting and the high painful space, the open air space in which it was acted out, was deeply entrenched in what it meant to be and live as a Roman citizen in the city. So what was Caesar up to? As has been well argued, Caesar was clearly responding to the recently constructed porticoes of Pompey, itself a colonnaded enclosure attached to a private house and containing politically functional space. To use Bill's phrasing, this is a prime case of competitive edificatia. That process whereby the leading statesmen of the Republic, each victorious in increasingly grand military campaigns and thus endowed with increasingly abundant booty, competed with one another through concerted spatial urban tactics. The process of aggressive one-upmanship we can read in their monuments erected on return to the city, on which I refer our students to the work of Davies and Popkin and Russell. For Pompey, his space found at the left of our map here was assigned to an experience of cultured leisure. It was a colonnaded enclosure replete with artistic spoils, fountains, shade, arboreal walkways, and attached to Rome's first permanent theatre. All of it was dedicated to Venus too. Caesar's project not only drastically outsized it, here we have the Saepta here, it visually outclassed it, for it was going to be adorned with marble, and it posed to manipulate the actual theatre of Roman politics, more explicitly in redefining the space for citizen participation in the elective and voting procedures. As Davies has cogently argued, while Pompey redefined the spaces of leisure, Caesar took it that step further by redefining the spaces of business and justice. By penning the sheep, that is, the Roman citizens, with a marble portico enclosure, Caesar appeared as if a shepherd herding the people of Rome. We trace here a sense of doublespeak. Ostensibly, it indicated the continuation of Republican tradition in recalling the importance of voting assemblies by monumentalizing them, but it was in fact commissioned by an unprecedented dictator in perpetuity who was to brand it with his own name. And so, in the very same process of glorifying the Republic, Caesar marked the autocratic term. So what does introducing a portico to a political space do? It changes them drastically. Intrinsically, a portico was a social space. And the recent essay by Angius in the above-mentioned City Encounters volume excellently establishes the role of colonnades throughout the city as spaces of urban sociability and the exchange of political ideas. In the face-to-face ecosystem of Republican politics, porticos provided an optimum environment for electoral candidates to engage in the traditional practices of ambire, circumere, so going around and canvassing. Think of these concepts like performed office hours, acted out in the space of the city, for we can't forget that Roman statesmen didn't have social media to promote themselves. As Angius points out, the nickname for political agitators that circulated around the Forum in the 1st century BC were called columnarii, a neologism that evoked the scene where they operated. And further, it is surprising that the overwhelming majority of politically loaded graffiti, which sadly no longer actually exists, but is corroborated by literary sources, were written and inscribed into columns or the statues those colonnade shelters. Porticos thus provided non-traditional, informal venues for political participation, and Caesar's porticos posed to redefine the locations of and interactions with the traditional forms and mechanics of life in the Republican system. So having established the Republican context, we now turn to laying out the completed Saepta in 26 BCE by Marcus Agrippa. As is so often the case in Rome, very little of this structure remains, and in fact, our best evidence comes in the form of a series of fragmentary representations of the city's monuments in ground plan, each portrayed by an assortment of lines and dots engraved into marble. I refer to that remarkable cartographic achievement, which was once anchored to a wall of a room within the porticos of the Templum Pacis, today known as the Severian Marble Plan. We encountered this source the other week in Francesco de Capriaris' excellent survey, and so I will only outline the key points for us tonight. Over the past half century, both the positioning of these fragments and our knowledge of the Saepta Iulia and its environs has changed quite radically. To cut a long story short, originally the Saepta was thought to be located closer to the Via del Corso, but following some ingenious repositioning of the fragments, it was moved closer to the Pantheon. What we have arrived at now is a mosaic of actual fragments as collected together in the excellent Pianta Memoria publication of 1960. A now lost fragment, known here from Roman Aeton's copy, gives us the northern limit of the space and combines well with the other fragments to give us the Porticus Meleagri and Saepta Iulia. When collecting together this information with the other sources, Gatti argued that we would find the Porticus Argonautorum of the Argonauts opposite that of Meleagri. Found to the north too is the Derivatorium, the place in which the votes were counted, and which we know was incorporated with the Saepta. We'll come to the naming of these porticos in a minute, but I just want to talk about the plan because there are some problems I need to address. A fundamental position here is that while this exceptional survival of evidence has informed a great many gaps in our knowledge, we need to take greater caution in scrutinising its minute details. The marble plan was created in the early 3rd century CE. And although in some cases the plan does show signs that it was composed of a series of older cadastral surveys, and for some of its depictions represent earlier chronological phases of the city, we need to take care in using the source for the Augustan period. The plan is also very often ambiguous in its graphic rendering of 3-dimensional space in 2 dimensions, and often features abbreviation and quite clear errors, but we should give the engravers a break. They were liable to slip up. It must not be understated that many of the minute details we spend so much time labouring over were virtually indistinguishable in the plan's original viewing context. Fundamentally, I think I seem to agree with the more current consensus that the plan was intended originally as a far more of a visual monument than a rigorous cartographic survey that could serve administrative purposes. More like the viewing experience as column, for instance, as Trimble has argued. There is also the point that in many cases, the plan does not marry well with the archaeological evidence on the ground. In the case of the Saepta, a recent research published in 2015 on the campus has quite convincingly shown that Gatti's identification of the quadriforms, so this is the 4-sided arch, at the centre of the porticus accrue, does not correspond well to what we have on the ground. Although there was probably an arch there, it's not quite as Gatti has pictured it here. Note too how in this same publication, 2 representations of the same space are, albeit slightly, incongruous. On the right, almost as if to make room for this arch that Gatti has identified, the copy fragment has been pushed further south by some distance, and this drastically alters the length of this space. All of this to say, we cannot take these graphical representations for granted. While Robert will tell you, problematizing can be effective, it is only useful when it poses a constructive path forward. Stones speak. If we look past the inherent shortcomings of interpreting an often ambiguous 2-dimensional representation as 3-dimensional lived-in space, the marble plan still offers us a lot of contextual information pertinent to the Saepta, without which we'd be much worse informed. What can it tell us then? Well, we have its location, its rough dimensions. At around 310 to 120 meters, this was an exceptionally large space in the city of Rome, one which came to define a distinct north-south axis of the campus and at around a tenth of the whole campus. In fact, if we do follow the plan, the porticoes of the Saepta are the largest single-aisled colonnade of any other which were depicted on the fragments we have, around 14 meters wide, which, if you appreciate perspective like I do, is roughly double or over double the size of the portico at the British School. And Corelli has argued, if you calculate the combined length of the enclosing porticos of the Saepta, it's roughly around half a mile. And this is maybe how we should understand Cicero's comment that we saw earlier about enclosing the voting enclosures with a portico a mile in length. With this plan as a model, scholars have tried to construct the spatial format of Rome's voting assemblies, and Lucas Kotzer, whose place in the walls we visited last week, created a graphic which has been utilised for many years since. Here we have presented the around 35 lateral aisles that the voting units were separated into, which allowed the voters to move towards the tribunal to cast their vote, and then also for the votes to be counted. As you might be able to see, though, this graphic is based on the longer positioning of the drawn fragments. And some scholars have proposed alternatives, especially in calculating the scale of voting, like how many people this space could actually accommodate. I became slightly tangled with all the various maps and reconstructions and the like, and I sort of channeled my inner Kotzer and produced a schematic plan, which we can use to talk about the layout of the Saepta. Apologies for it, but I'll walk you through it. So we have an open space defined on 3 sides by porticos. At the southern end, we find the derivatorium, the place where the votes were counted, which is not without interest, but maybe not tonight. And also Fontinus, a guy who writes on aqueducts, informs us that the northern limit of the Saepta was bordered by the Aqua Virgo, which we have evidence for on the Via del Seminario. And so we have a northern limit. The eastern and western porticos are very probably the porticos of Meleager and the Argonauts. Although not certain, the portico of the Argonauts was probably completed by Agrippa and was decorated with artworks representing Jason and his crew. In fact, some remains Rhythmic, although from a later chronological phase, certainly come from this portico. We find a series of raised niches, which run the whole length of the interior space of this portico, and which we would probably find some sort of paintings of representations of the life cycle or the story of the Argonauts. Analogously, on the other side, the portico of Meleager most probably contained a representation of the hunt of the Caledonian boar, but this is treated as not much evidence ascribed to it. In fact, the only evidence for this is the marble plan and the regionary catalogues which put the porticus Argonautorum and Meleagri together. How does this all work together? We know of Agrippa's famous address, which expressed the need to display publicly all Greek statues and works of art, instead of hiding them away in private villas and elite urban dwellings. And this concept or this immorality related to the display of imported artworks is very important for thinking about Roman urban space. Significantly, the names of these porticos, after the artworks they framed, speak to the collective and social understanding of the experience of these structures pertaining to artistic display. These porticos were to be for the citizens of Rome, a kind of villa for the common people, as Zanca has put it. Also, ideologically, as Bravi has excellently argued, the artistic program of this portico enclosure underscored the Roman mastery of land and sea, which is a key theme in Augustan visual culture and throughout, to be fair. Yet more artwork contributed to the experience of the space. Pliny the Elder informs us of two sculptural groups, one representing Olympus and Pan, and the other Achilles and Chiron, which, as later sources inform us, coexisted with the paintings and were thus probably sheltered in the porticos. Very probably, then probably not going to be in the open air space. In the same passage, Pliny gripes that it is impossible to contemplate and admire the great number of artworks properly because of the multitude of distractions they're experiencing. And he informs us that the artists behind of these sculptures, because of the multitude of distraction, that the artists have been forgotten. Poggio has discussed this concept of the distraction city in depth with special reference to the Saepta, and has rightly brought the experience of imported artwork into Rome into sharper focus. While the modern museum has clear parallels of portico spaces, and this has been well argued by Macaulay Lewis, and also especially when we consider the social rituals that museums and galleries frame today, they're not wholly synonymous. And following our very own Robert Coates-Stephens, these were alive, religiously and politically functioning spaces where a museum mentality was detected, in the sense that materials were collected from diverse sources and re-exhibited in context with different and ever-changing meanings. We may come to that in the questions. Moving forward, this increased focus on artistic display, foregrounded by political demonstration in the voting procedures, has important bearing for the use of the space throughout the Augustan period. Anticipating the decreasing political relevance of citizen assemblies in the empire, the Saepta became host to public entertainments of increasing lavishness, themselves occasions for popular communication with the new ruling power. To give some examples, Augustus utilised the space for beast hunts, which were no doubt in conversation with the portico of Meleager, and put on gladiatorial contests in 7 BC for Agrippa's funeral. And topography has so much meaning in Rome, and this is probably the best place for Agrippa to have this celebration: the Pantheon, the Saepta, the baths, stag. Anyway, he also utilised the space for games in 2 BC, celebrating the inauguration of his forum. And also, when Tiberius returned from a military campaign in the north, Augustus went out to meet him and brought him through the city, accompanied him to the Saepta, and from there, Tiberius greeted the Roman citizens who congregated in the piazza. The spatialization of societal hierarchies in these formalized occasions must not be understated. Further spectacles were put on by members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, including gladiatorial combat, gymnastic contests, and even by excavating, I don't know how they do this, excavating and infilling the space for a body of water, the exhibition of a ship. In fact, as Poggio also points out, Suetonius has every Julio-Claudian emperor use the space for spectacles in some capacity. In all of this, it is important to appreciate the role of these sites as porticoes and recall Vitruvius's comments regarding italic fora and the functional explanations for their enclosing colonnades. They are envisaged as sheltered spaces for the observation of gladiatorial combat. This is what defines a Roman fora as opposed to a Greek. In a kind of visual simulacrum to the Roman forum, the Saepta's porticoes themselves spaces for artistic display, constituted frames in which to observe the spectacles playing out in the open-air piazza. In sum, this friendly narrated enclosure dramatised popular participation in the running of the state, and at the very same time spatialised the dynamics of power from controlled and internally focused architectures. During the Augustan period, then, the Saepta, which was originally a place where people exercised their constitutional authority, was now a colonnaded piazza which inscribed power through its enclosure of public space, where the people and the imperial family participated together in rituals of consensus. Moving now onto our final context, the late 1st century CE, so nearly a century after the inauguration of the Saepta. Following the Great Fire of 80 CE, which ravaged a great part of the campus, destroying many buildings, it is clear that Domitian quickly restored the porticoes, as contemporary sources consistently refer to using the space. One of whom, the poet Martial, describes the Saepta as the space in which golden Rome flaunts its wealth. Martial has a caricature named Marmora in the same poem, wandering around the space of the Saepta at leisure. The way in which the Romans experienced porticos was generally, monumental porticos, was generally in one of leisure, which has been very well described by Macaulay Lewis in the Rome Ostia Pompeii edited volume I pointed out earlier. So Marmora is inspecting, he's walking around and he's inspecting and devouring the scene with his eyes. This is where Rome's cosmopolitan quality is displayed and consumed. Marmora searches for slave boys, browses luxury goods such as glass vessels, miniature statues of Polyclitus, ivory furniture, and turns his nose up at the pang of bronze smelts. The literary presentation of the Saepta then teases the sensorium, moving around, sight, touch, smell, noise. If one calls to mind the bazaars of the Middle East and Southern Asia, I don't think that's too far off the mark. And indeed, I would not be the first to make the theoretically lucrative comparison with the arcades of late 18th and 19th century Paris and in Europe more generally as well. For us, though, it's important that the artwork on display in the porticos intermingles with this commercial experience. Juvenal, a contemporary of Martial, has Jason, the navigator of the Argo, become a merchant whose paintings have been shut off from view by the ongoing flow of activity. In this way, the new functionality of the porticos have redefined how their artwork was achieved. If we consider the fact that columns so often perform as formal framing devices in artistic representations, even in this marble relief here on the right, if one stood in a physical portico space and looked through the intercolumniation, so through the space created by the colonnades, the open-air piazza outside performs almost as a moving picture. And this is where the artwork takes backstage and the systems take front and center. Just to illustrate this a bit more, we're nearly there, guys. Let's take one of Martial's epigrams in depth. Now, this has been well discussed by O'Sullivan in his book on Walking in Roman Culture, which I urge you to go and read if you're interested in the things we've been talking about this evening. So, the diachronic opening, that man, which you all see, has the double effect of first placing the reader into a recognizable urban framework, and second, of classifying the experience as one of collective observation. Martial picks out an imagined a man among an imagined crowd, a generic figure, and relies on shared experiences to give shape to the scene. That man you all see has so much embedded within it. Costumes, props, and the supporting actors add further susceptible layers to the show. The anonymous pretender's luxuriant dress is cast in high relief by his obedient entourage, some of whom subscribe, like sheep, if we remember the sheepfold, to the status embedded in donning the coat. Others are singled out for their hairstyle. Here we stand witness to the patron-client relationship in action, with the illustration inviting us to derive meaning from the comparative presentation of its figures. In order to maximize the ambulatory performance, as O'Sullivan puts it, our protagonist is at pains to ensure the highest level of visibility in urban space. As he walks about, he strategically cuts across the open air space, and he consciously canvasses the area and actively demonstrates the right to stroll, how, where, and with whom he chooses. Martial's jest is underscored by the poem's structure, the sequence of subordinate clauses describing the stroller 1 through 6 culminate in the main clause 7 through 8, which, just as the curtain falls, debunks the charade and pokes fun at the politics of urban display. For our protagonist, though he's dressed the part, looks the part, and acts the part, had to pawn his own ring to eat dinner that evening. In Marshall's Rome, then, seeing and being seen counted. This idea of conspectus is so important when we look at open space. The poet gives us a crucial role in that interplay. We are encouraged to spectate and commentate. Without us, our protagonist has no corroborating audience. Just as when a tree falls in the forest without a perceiver, the stroller requires human reception to be understood. The forest here is architectural, constituted by the ordered colonnades of an urban stage, the Saepta Iulia. Just by way of a final example, here's a most famous passage from Juvenal. We'll read it. Powerful people are fools and don't know what to wish for. But what about the crowd of common people? As always, they idolize success and save their contempt for losers. Ever since we lost the right to sell our votes, so that is in the Saepta, the people toss their civic cares aside. The citizen, who once had final say over the legions, the fasces, and the world through voting, contracts himself to the issues of ultimate concern, bread and circuses. In summing up the diachronic change we have just charted, Juvenal displays a sensitivity to the transition of a politically functional space to one of spectacle and leisure. Now, so what is indeed a terrifying question which we researchers should really try to answer. But I strongly believe that even though many people more informed than I, such as Grow, Nuneric, Asmus, Macaulay, Lewis, and Sensini, have looked into porticoes, their role as an architectural form has yet to be fully synthesized and integrated into our understanding of Roman urban. To a pre-industrial Mediterranean society in which daily life was acted out in open-air space, a structural medium capable of systemizing activity had significant potential. Porticos constitute the building block of Roman urbanism, a city's connective tissue that weaves its landmarks and nodes together, engendering a degree of legibility in the urban narrative, the urban armature of McDonald's. Porticos were intrinsically social spaces, and our sources helped to enliven them with interaction and colour and motion. In their capacity to be combined into L, pi, and square-shaped formations, they came to organise all aspects of Roman society. The unifying aspect of the portico's functional multivalence, however, was its ability to structure experience, bequeathing a columnar framework to the routines of urban life, one which fused the bipedal rhythm of the individual to the intercolumnar rhythm of the city. At the Saepta, we have seen how a once politically functioning space was manipulated and transformed to better suit and actively underline the changing mechanics of power. Through routine, daily interactions among the porticos of the Saepta, Roman citizens exercised and developed their roles, interpreting, responding to, and redefining their positions in a political system. Now, we've covered a lot of ground tonight. I hope that you come away with something, perhaps a renewed interest in the urban spaces. I urge you to challenge you even to look up at the cities that we inhabit, look up from your phone, stop taking photos, think about, talk about, and engage with the spaces which we inhabit. Thank you.